I remember the exact moment everything changed. I was sitting in a small corner restaurant, the same one my family always used for important conversations, holding a folder I had spent 4 months building. Inside were venue quotes, catering estimates, photographer packages, and a detailed budget breakdown. My hands were steady but my heart was hammering. My fiancé Michael had squeezed my shoulder before I left. "They'll say yes," he told me. "You've always been the responsible one." I believed him. I walked through that restaurant door believing my parents, Linda and Mitchell, would look at the numbers and say yes. Instead, my mother barely glanced at the folder before sliding it back across the table. She touched her pearl necklace the way she always did before delivering bad news. Then she sighed. "Sweetheart, this wedding is just too expensive." My father nodded without opening the folder. And across the table, my younger brother Jake smirked. That smirk told me everything I needed to know. Mitchell nodded along like the decision had been made before I walked through the door. Maybe it had. I reminded them both that they had promised to help when Michael proposed 2 years earlier. My mother smiled tightly and said they needed to be responsible with their savings. I asked how much they were contributing. She changed the subject. Then Jake casually mentioned his 3rd wedding coming up the following summer. The energy in the room completely shifted. My parents' voices lifted, their eyes brightened, and they began excitedly discussing venues and caterers, all the things I had just presented, but now enthusiastically, for him. Right in front of me. My folder sat pushed to the edge of the table. I watched my parents plan my brother's 3rd wedding while I sat across from them with my rejected budget, and something cold and quiet began settling into my chest. That night marked the end of something. The end of me believing I was seen the same way Jake was seen. The end of waiting for fairness that was never going to come. Growing up in Riverside, there was an unspoken rule in our house. Jake's problems became family problems, and my problems became my problems alone. He crashed his first car at 17. My parents replaced it. He dropped out of college after 1 semester. My parents said he needed time to find himself. He got arrested at 23. My parents hired a lawyer and never mentioned it again. Meanwhile, I worked 2 jobs through college, graduated near the top of my class, and moved out at 22 without ever asking for money. I was proud of that independence. I thought my parents were proud too. But sitting in that restaurant, watching them light up for Jake's 3rd wedding after dismissing mine, I started questioning the story I had been telling myself my whole life. I had believed that being reliable and responsible would eventually be recognized. That the scales would balance. They never had. And then my mother leaned across the table and said something I will never forget as long as I live. She folded her hands and looked at me with an expression that was almost kind. "Your brother just needs more support than you," she said. Like that explained everything. Like that made it fair. Jake actually raised his glass after she said it. He raised it slowly and took a sip while watching my face, waiting for a reaction. Michael wasn't there that night. I had wanted to talk to my parents alone first. I regretted that immediately. There was nobody beside me, no hand to squeeze, no eyes to meet across the table to remind me I wasn't imagining things. I had learned early in life that showing emotion at that table only gave Jake ammunition. So I kept my face completely still. I folded my papers back into the folder and said I understood. I drove home. I didn't cry until I was parked in the driveway. I sat in the dark for 20 minutes while the engine ticked and cooled, and I let myself feel every bit of it. Then I wiped my face, walked inside, and told Michael everything. Michael listened without rushing to fix things or jumping ahead of me. When I finished, he asked a question I had been avoiding. What if they were never planning to help you at all? I didn't answer. I made tea. I straightened things on the counter that didn't need straightening. Because the honest answer was that I had suspected it for months. 2 days after the restaurant, I got confirmation. My cousin Renee sent me a message, "An accident," she said immediately after, and it was a screenshot from a family group chat I wasn't in. My mother had sent a message bragging about how she and Mitchell had been quietly setting aside money for Jake's wedding. $40,000. She called it their gift to the family. 3 heart emojis at the end. I read it 3 times. Then I sat down on the kitchen floor and stared at the refrigerator for a very long time. The rejection at the restaurant suddenly made complete sense. There had never been a shortage of money. There had only ever been a shortage of willingness, and it was directed specifically at me. The Sunday family dinners in Riverside were a tradition I had always honored, even when exhausted, even when Jake made things uncomfortable. I kept showing up because I believed in the idea of family. But the Sunday after the screenshot, everything was different. My mother started talking about weddings during the salad course, framing my situation carefully for the aunt and cousins at the table. She said I had decided to downsize because I was being realistic. She smiled warmly while she said it. Jake added loudly that maybe Michael should pick up another job if we wanted something nicer. Everyone chuckled. I kept my face neutral and cut my food into small, even pieces. I was no longer sad. Something had shifted. What lived in my chest now was quieter and sharper than sadness. I was paying very careful attention to everything. And I was beginning to realize, for the first time clearly, that I had information my family didn't know I had, information that was about to matter enormously. After dinner, I pulled my mother aside into the hallway. I asked her directly, no raised voice, no tears, why she was saving $40,000 for Jake's third wedding while refusing to help with mine. She looked annoyed rather than guilty. Because Jake needs stability, she said. I asked what that meant. She straightened a picture frame on the wall that was already straight. Then she said, your brother's third wedding is important for the family image. I stood very still. And mine isn't. She didn't answer. She walked back toward the kitchen and called over her shoulder that there was pie left. I stood alone in the hallway staring at the picture she had straightened. It was a family photo from when Jake and I were children. He was laughing. I was standing slightly apart, looking at the camera with a serious expression, like even at 8 years old I understood the rules were different for me. I drove home that night knowing something had permanently changed. I was done waiting for them to be fair. I was going to handle this myself. I stopped arguing entirely after that night. When the subject came up at dinner or on the phone, I smiled pleasantly and changed the subject or said nothing at all. I stopped explaining myself. What they didn't realize was that I had been quietly thinking about something I had been managing for them for 3 years. When I was 26, my parents had asked me to help with the administrative side of their small rental portfolio. 3 units in Riverside and 1 in a neighboring county. They were good at buying property and completely overwhelmed by the paperwork. Taxes, legal filings, mortgage coordination, insurance renewals. Jake had been asked first but said numbers stressed him out. The job fell to me. I was organized, careful, and genuinely didn't mind at the time. Over 3 years I had built spreadsheets, set up systems, and coordinated with their accountant and property lawyer. I had become the only person in my family who truly understood the full picture of my parents' finances. And during a recent routine review of their files, I had discovered something important, something they absolutely did not know about themselves. My parents believed they were wealthy. They talked about money the way people do when they've never had to worry about it, confidently, casually. But 3 years of managing their paperwork had shown me the real picture. 2 of their mortgages had adjustable rates that had quietly climbed. Their property taxes had increased significantly after a reassessment. Their actual liquid savings, the money they could access without triggering penalties, were far smaller than they realized. The $40,000 set aside for Jake's wedding wasn't sitting in a simple bank account. A large portion was tied up in assets I had helped legally structure to protect their investments. Those assets required my co-authorization to be liquidated quickly. I had set it up that way because it was financially smart and protected them from impulsive decisions. I had done it entirely for their benefit. But sitting at my kitchen table staring at those documents, I understood something new. My parents were about to try to access that money without understanding what it would actually take. And I was the only person in the world who knew how complicated that was going to be. Jake's engagement party invitation arrived by text. Gold script, a date 6 weeks out. My parents were hosting it at their house, complete with new string lights, catering, and a hired bartender. Michael saw the invitation over my shoulder and asked if I really wanted to go. I thought about it. Part of me wanted to skip everything and keep quietly building my own life. But another part of me, the part that had spent 3 years doing invisible work while being publicly dismissed, felt something different. I thought about my mother's announcement at Sunday dinner. I thought about Jake raising his glass. The screenshot from the chat I wasn't in. The $40,000. My rejected folder sitting at the edge of the table. I set down my phone. "I'm going," I told Michael. He studied my face for a long moment. He knew my calm well enough to understand it wasn't emptiness, it was purpose. He nodded slowly. "Then I'm coming with you," he said. And that was all either of us needed to say. The party was warm and full. My mother circulated in a yellow dress, laughing, glowing with the happiness that comes from being the center of a celebration. Jake stood near the drinks table looking relaxed, his new fiancée Cassie beside him with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I arrived with Michael, greeted everyone warmly, said all the right things. About 40 minutes in, my mother spotted me across the yard and walked over. Before I could speak, she announced loudly to nearby relatives, "Your sister decided on a smaller wedding since her original plan wasn't realistic." Several heads turned. I felt Michael's hand at my back. I smiled pleasantly. "That's fine," I said. "Michael and I have been focusing our energy on other things lately." I left it there. No elaboration. I watched a few relatives exchange curious glances. I watched my mother wait for me to explain. I didn't. I had learned something over the past 2 months. The most powerful thing I could do in that family was refuse to perform for them. And I was done performing. An hour into the party, my father steered me quietly to the edge of the garden. He had that look, casual on the surface, urgent underneath, that I recognized from years of him asking me to handle things. He needed to transfer money to Jake's wedding venue by Monday. The deposit required proof of funds. He asked if I could move money from the account we co-managed. I looked at him steadily. Then I explained, as clearly and gently as I could, that moving that amount from that specific account wasn't as simple as he imagined. Because of the legal structure I had set up, designed to protect him and my mother, to prevent tax penalties and honor their mortgage agreements, that account required my co-authorization for any withdrawal above a threshold. He blinked. "What do you mean?" he said. I explained again. He had asked me to build it this way. I had explained it to him at the time, though clearly the details hadn't stayed with him. He stared at me. Then he called my mother over. The tone of the party was about to change permanently. My mother arrived and I walked her through the same explanation. She looked at me like I was making excuses. "Linda, just sign whatever paperwork he needs and let's move on," she said. I explained it wasn't a single signature. Moving this money quickly could trigger penalties on 2 of their mortgage agreements and create complications with a property tax appeal their accountant was currently managing. These were real numbers. I had checked. By then Jake had noticed our conversation and wandered over. His expression shifted as he registered the tension. "What's going on?" My father tried to explain. Jake's face changed. "What do you mean she has to authorize it?" His voice was rising. A few guests nearby glanced over. My mother touched his arm. Jake shook her off. "This is my engagement party. This is not the time for this." I kept my voice very quiet. "I agree completely. We should sit down when there's more time to review the details properly." Jake did not accept that. He had never in his life accepted an answer that didn't give him exactly what he wanted exactly when he wanted it. He accused me of doing it on purpose. Of always being jealous and using a technicality to ruin his wedding. His voice was climbing and more guests had turned to watch. Cassie appeared at his elbow with a worried expression. My mother was shushing him. My father studied the ground. I kept my posture straight and my voice level. "Jake, this isn't a technicality. Their properties are in the middle of a financial review for the tax appeal. Moving a large sum right now without going through the right process could jeopardize that appeal and cost them far more than the deposit you need." Everything I said was true. It was the same information I would have shared with my parents months ago if anyone had thought to ask how their finances actually worked. Jake stared at me. Then he said the thing that revealed exactly who he was. He didn't ask what the correct process was. He didn't ask how to solve the problem. He said, "Then fix it. Right now." As if I existed solely to remove his obstacles. The guests nearby had gone quiet. My relatives were exchanging glances. The room was listening. My mother tried to wave the situation away with a light laugh. "It's just a small mix-up. Linda is handling it." She said my name like I was staff. My father's older sister, Aunt Patricia, stepped closer. She had been watching since Jake's voice first rose. "Wait," she said. "Linda manages all of your rental paperwork." My mother gave a thin smile. "She's always been the practical one." "So she's been doing this for years?" Aunt Patricia pressed. My father cleared his throat. "We compensate her," he said. This was not true. I had never been paid a single dollar. I had done it because they were my parents and I thought that's what good daughters did. I looked at my father. He looked away. My mother was already pivoting toward other guests, trying to redirect. But Aunt Patricia was still watching me, and her expression had changed from polite curiosity to something sharper. She was putting a picture together she hadn't seen clearly before, and based on what I saw on her face, she didn't much like what it was showing her. The mood had shifted and everyone could feel it. Conversations continued but voices were lower and eyes kept drifting toward our corner of the garden. Aunt Patricia asked me directly whether I had been doing all of this without compensation. I said yes. She turned and looked at my parents. My father studied the string lights overhead. My mother said something about how family helps family in a tone meant to close the subject. It didn't work. One of Jake's childhood cousins said quietly, "I didn't know any of this." Another relative nodded slowly. The story was spreading through the party the way truth does when it finally gets air, not loudly, but steadily, reaching people one at a time. Cassie had stepped away from Jake. She stood near the flower arrangement watching him with an expression that wasn't supportive, it was assessing. I hadn't planned any of this. I had simply answered questions honestly, never raised my voice, and refused, for the first time in my adult life, to be invisible. And refusing to disappear had a power I had never understood before. Aunt Patricia asked my father plainly how much liquid savings they actually had available right now. He looked deeply uncomfortable. He glanced at my mother. She gave him a tiny headshake. He stared at the ground. But the question had been heard by too many people to vanish. He cleared his throat. He said their financial situation was more complex than people realize. He said the wedding fund was mostly projected asset value rather than cash on hand. Moving money right now wasn't as simple as writing a check. As he spoke, the expressions around him shifted. The relatives who had nodded along at Sunday dinners about Jake's dream wedding, they were doing the math now. Whispers moved through the group. Jake looked at my father with an expression I had never seen on him before. Something stripped bare. Something young and confused underneath all that confidence. "What do you mean it's not cash?" he said quietly. My father didn't answer. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Even the bartender went still. The silence broke when one of Jake's own cousins, someone with no stake in our family drama, let out a short laugh and said, "Jake, man, why does the third wedding need to be this big anyway?" It wasn't cruel exactly. It was the kind of thing someone says when they've been thinking it politely for too long. Laughter rippled through part of the crowd. Someone murmured something I couldn't catch, but the two people nearest them suppressed smiles. Jake looked around the garden at faces that were supposed to be celebrating him. He found amusement, awkwardness, and carefully blank expressions, but not what he was searching for. He looked for his mother and found her staring at the flower arrangement. He looked for Cassie. She was standing several feet away, arms folded, her polite smile completely gone, watching him the way someone watches a situation they're deciding whether to stay in. Jake opened his mouth. Closed it again. The bartender quietly polished glasses. I stood very still. I did not smile. I waited for a quiet moment, then spoke to the small group of relatives still nearby. I said Michael and I had made a decision I wanted to share. We weren't having a big wedding. Instead, we had taken our savings, money I had been carefully building for 6 years, and put a down payment on a house. 3 bedrooms, a yard, in a neighborhood we had always loved. We had closed 3 weeks ago. The reaction was immediate and genuine. Several relatives congratulated us warmly. Aunt Patricia hugged me. Renee grabbed my hand and squeezed it. People asked about the neighborhood, the size, when we were moving in. The energy in that corner of the garden lifted completely. For a few minutes it felt like an actual celebration. I watched my parents from across the yard. My mother had gone completely still. My father was staring at me with an expression somewhere between surprise and something that might have been grief if I had felt generous enough to name it. I let him look. I didn't look away. My mother crossed the yard once the congratulations died down and pulled me slightly aside. She was looking for the right tone, something between warmth and control, the blend she had always worn most comfortably. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked. I looked at her steadily. I thought about the folder pushed back across the restaurant table. The Sunday dinner where she announced I had decided to downsize. The screenshot from the group chat I wasn't in. "I did tell you," I said. "I told you I had been focusing on other things. You assumed you knew what that meant." She was quiet. Her eyes moved to Jake, standing alone near the garden's edge. Most guests had drifted to the food table. He looked smaller than usual, like something invisible had been propping him up all evening and had quietly stopped. She looked back at me. The armor she usually wore, that particular confidence that made her feel untouchable, was absent. What I saw instead was something I had never seen on her face before. Confusion. Like the map she had used to navigate our family had stopped matching the ground beneath her feet. Around 9 o'clock Jake came back into the center of the party. The alcohol and humiliation had mixed into something ugly. He said loudly that everyone was turning against him, that I had planned the whole evening to steal his moment, that I had always been jealous and difficult. He said our parents had dealt with my attitude for years. The relatives nearby went quiet. I kept my face completely still. Michael stood beside me and said nothing, which was exactly right. The more Jake talked, the less traction he found. Because everyone had just witnessed what actually happened. They had heard about 3 years of unpaid work. They had seen my parents fail to meet his eyes when asked about finances. They had watched him demand I fix things like I was built to serve him. Nobody argued back. Nobody validated him. The silence was, I think, the worst thing he had ever encountered in his life. He stopped mid-sentence, looked around at the unimpressed faces, and walked off the property. Cassie watched him go. Then she looked at me and gave one small, tired nod. She followed him. Her expression said everything. My father found me as guests were leaving, near the rose bushes my mother had planted years ago and never let anyone else touch. He waited until we were alone. He stood with his hands in his pockets and his shoulders slightly forward, and he looked older than I had ever noticed. He apologized. Not quickly. Not in his usual way of covering it over before the words could land. Slowly, like he was feeling the full weight of it. He said they had relied on me for years and taken it completely for granted. He said he had known the arrangement was unfair, and had told himself it didn't matter because I was capable and Jake wasn't. He said he understood now how deeply wrong that reasoning had always been. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I thanked him. I meant it. It was the most honest thing he had said to me in years, possibly ever. It didn't fix anything. But it was real. And after years of performance, something real is worth holding. The next morning Michael made coffee and we sat at the kitchen table of the apartment we were about to leave. I told him about my father's apology. Then I told him what I had decided. I was done managing my parents' finances. Not as punishment or revenge. Simply because I was no longer willing to carry that responsibility without it being a real, agreed-upon, compensated arrangement between adults. I would give them a proper handover, complete documentation, a clean transition to their accountant and property lawyer. I would do it thoroughly, because that was how I did everything. But I was closing the chapter. That afternoon I called my mother and told her exactly what I had told Michael. She was quiet for a long time. Then she asked what they were supposed to do without me. I told her they would figure it out or they would hire someone, and either way the systems I had built were solid. She asked if this was about the wedding money. I said no. It was about 3 years of invisible work that had been mistaken for a personality trait. She said softly, "I understand." I didn't know if she truly did. But I accepted it. 2 weeks after the engagement party, Renee messaged me. Cassie had asked to postpone the wedding, indefinitely. The evening at the party had opened a longer conversation about finances and expectations. Jake had apparently been telling Cassie for over a year that his parents would cover the wedding entirely. The engagement party had made clear to her that this wasn't the solid foundation she had believed it to be. I read the message and set my phone down on the counter. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something quieter, a tiredness, and underneath it, clean relief. My parents spent the following weeks navigating their finances without me for the first time in 3 years. Their accountant called twice for clarification on files I had handed over. I helped both times, briefly and clearly, because I had never wanted to leave them stranded. I simply was no longer the one responsible for holding everything together. The difference felt enormous. Like finally setting down something I had carried for so long I had forgotten what it felt like to walk without the weight. 6 months later, Michael and I hosted a housewarming. The house was everything we had imagined. Bright rooms, a backyard where afternoon light came in just right, a kitchen wide enough to cook in side by side. We invited close friends, neighbors, Aunt Patricia, Renee, and people who had been genuinely kind. At the last moment, I invited my parents. They came quietly, arriving after most guests, carrying a small potted plant. My mother walked through the rooms with her usual confidence replaced by something more careful. My father shook Michael's hand and said he was proud of us. I believed him. I made sure they both had drinks and food. I introduced them to our neighbors. I treated them exactly as I treated everyone else, with warmth and nothing performed. Because I had finally understood what had taken me my whole adult life to see. I didn't need to win their approval. I didn't need to compete with Jake or prove anything to people who had already made up their minds. I had built a life, quietly, carefully, entirely with my own hands, where none of that was required. And standing in my own home, in my own light, that turned out to be more than enough.